The air felt heavy that night, like a wet blanket pressed down on the small town of Olorun. It was past midnight when a little boy, Kayode, not older than 10, woke with a start. A strange chill snake coiled around his ankles. Even though his small room was too stuffy, he blinked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and listened. His mother and father were usually loud sleepers. Their snores were like a familiar rhythm in the night, a sound that always meant things were safe. But tonight, it was not as usual, only a silence that hummed in his ears, a silence that felt wrong. He got out of his bed, standing with his bare feet on a cool, dusty floor. The moonlight, which is usually a soft glow, now seemed harsh, painting long, eerie shadows on the walls. His heart started to beat a little faster, like a tiny drum in his chest. He clutched his worn wooden toy, a small elephant with one broken tusk, and slowly, carefully pushed his door open. The hallway was darker than his room, swallowing the faint moonlight. A funny smell tickled his nose, something metallic and sweet, like the juice from overripe mangoes, but different, much more clinging. He tiptoed towards his parents' room, and his breath was catching in his throat with each creak of the floorboards. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness visible within. He pushed it open a little more, just enough to peek inside. What he saw made his eyes widen, and a tiny whimper escaped from his lips. His mother lay on the bed, but she didn't look like his mother. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but they were dull, like old marbles. And there was a dark, sticky puddle on the white sheets, spreading like a growing shadow. He didn't understand, but a cold fear, sharp and clear, pierced him. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The silence in the room was louder than any noise he had ever heard, pressing against his ears and making them ache. His mother's hand, usually so warm and soft, lay limp on the bed, and it was covered in that strange, dark liquid. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it shouldn't be there. A thought that brought a confused mix of fear and nausea. His small mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing, desperately trying to find a normal explanation. He looked around the room, hoping to find his father, hoping for someone to tell him it was all a bad dream. The window was open, letting in a faint, cool breeze that moved the curtains like a quick, anxious breath. Outside, the night was still, but a low, guttural sound, like a hungry dog, echoed faintly from far away, sending shivers down his spine. He took a shaky step back, his toy elephant slipping from his grasp and landing with a soft thud on the floor. His eyes darted back to his mother, and then he saw it, a deep, ragged tear in her throat, a gaping wound that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The dark liquid wasn't just on the sheets, it was everywhere. A macabre painting on her nightgown, on the pillow, even on the floor beside the bed. A wave of nausea hit the little boy, a feeling so strong it made his stomach clench and heave. He didn't understand what had happened, but he knew, deep in his gut, that something terribly wrong, something truly evil had visited their home. His breath hitched, and a small, terrified sob finally broke free from his throat. And he knew he had to find his father. He stumbled backward, his legs feeling like jelly, and he turned to run to escape the horrific image of his mother. But a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room, tall and menacing, blocking his path. A woman stood there, her face hidden in the gloom, but her eyes, two pinpricks of light, seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity. She wore a dark, flowing gown that seemed to absorb what little light was in the room. A strange, sickly sweet odor, much stronger now, clung to her, a smell that made her head spin and feel heavy. He tried to scream again, tried to push the sound out, but his voice was trapped in his throat, like a silent cry of a pure terror. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to become invisible, trying to melt into the shadows, but her gaze was fixed on him, like a predator on its prey. The woman raised a hand, long skeletal fingers reaching out towards him, moving slowly and deliberately. A low, guttural chuckle, dry and brittle like dead leaves, emanated from her. It wasn't a sound of joy, but of something ancient and cold, something that had feasted on fear for a long time. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like a frantic bird trying to escape its cage, and he felt dizzy and faint. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could disappear, wishing he could wake up from this nightmare and find himself safe in his bed. But the cold, unnatural air around her and the coppery scent of his mother's blood told him this was terrifyingly real, not a dream. He opened his eyes, and she was closer now, her face still shadowed in the room, but he could see the glint of something sharp in her hand. It wasn't a knife, not exactly. It was long and curved, like a ceremonial blade, reflecting the faint moonlight with a wicked gleam that made his stomach twist. He tried to shrink back further, but his back was already pressed hard against the wall, leaving nowhere to go, no more space for him to hide. His mind raced, trying to remember what his grandmother had told him about evil spirits, about things that walked in the night. But none of those stories had ever prepared him for this, for the raw, visceral terror that was gripping him now. He could hear his own ragged breathing, loud and desperate in the suffocating silence, a noise that felt like it would give him away. The woman took another step, and the blade glinted again, closer this time, and he could almost feel the cold metal against his skin, a phantom touch that made him flinch hard. He remembered his father telling him to be brave, to be strong, to stand tall, but all strength had left him, draining out of his arms and legs. He was just a small boy, alone in the dark, facing something that felt impossibly ancient and evil, a pure darkness. A single tear tracked a path down his dusty cheek, hot against his cold skin, and he wanted his mother. He wanted his father. He wanted anything but this chilling, silent threat. Suddenly, a crashing sound came from downstairs, like something heavy falling, followed by a muffled yell, a sound that snapped the woman's focus away from him. The woman froze, her head snapping towards the sound, her glowing eyes narrowing, momentarily losing their cold, focused intensity. The interruption, though terrifying in itself because it was another strange and loud noise, offered a brief reprieve, a tiny crack in the suffocating fear that held him. His heart leapt with the flicker of hope, but it was a desperate and fearful hope. Could it be his father? Was he safe downstairs? Or was he in danger too, now involved with this terrifying woman and her dark business? The thought made a new wave of panic wash over him, but this time it was laced with a desperate need to know, to understand what it was. He wanted to shout, to warn whoever was downstairs, but his voice remained stubbornly absent. The woman hesitated for only a moment, her eyes darting between him and the door, then turned, her flowing gown swirling around her as she glided out of the room, leaving him alone in the terrifying silence once more. He heard her footsteps, light and unnervingly swift, descending the stairs, a soft, quick padding sound. He stood there for a long moment, frozen,
listening to the fading sounds and waiting for the next noise. The house, usually so full of life and noise, was now a tomb, echoing with the memory of screams that hadn't been made. He knew he had to move, but his limbs felt heavy, like they were made of lead and bolted to the floor. His mind was a jumble of fear and confusion, spinning with the images of his mother and the sight of the strange, cruel woman. He slowly, cautiously walked out of his parents' room, his gaze fixed on the dark stairway, terrified of what he might see next. He could hear faint whispers now, low and sibilant, like snakes slithering over stones, coming from downstairs. They were not human voices, not sounds he recognized as normal talking. A new kind of terror began to bloom in his chest, colder and more insidious than before, because it meant they were more than one of them, a whole group of them lurking in the darkness of his own home, doing unspeakable things. He hugged himself, his small arms trying to offer some comfort, but it was useless against this monumental fear. He debated what to do next. Should he hide right now in the hallway? Should he try to escape out of the window and run? But where would he go in the night? The whispers grew louder, and he heard a soft, rhythmic thud, like something being dragged across the wooden floor, heavy and slow. He imagined terrible things, things that made the hairs on his arms stand on end, twisting his stomach into knots. He knew he shouldn't go downstairs, that it was the most dangerous place to be, but a morbid curiosity mixed with the desperate need to find his father and see if he was safe tugged at him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart, and slowly, one agonizing step at a time, he began to descend the stairs. Each step down the creaking wooden stairs was an agony, a silent scream of fear that he couldn't let out. The whispers grew clearer, and he could make out fragments of words, strange names and chants that made no sense to him but filled him with dread because they sounded so wrong. The metallic, sweet smell was much stronger now, so potent that it made his eyes water and his nose burned. He could taste it in the back of his throat, a sickly, coppery tang that made him feel ill. He clutched the railing, his knuckles white with the force of his grip, and peered into the dimly lit living room below, bracing himself for another terrible sight. What he saw made his blood run cold, stopping his breath in his chest. Several figures, all cloaked in dark garments like the woman upstairs, moved around his living room. A large dark cloth was spread on the floor, and on it something moved, something that looked like a body, his father's body. A gasp escaped his lips, a tiny strangled sound that was swallowed by the terrifying whispers of the figures. He saw one of them, a gaunt older woman, raise a glistening blade and then bring it down with a sickening thud onto what he now clearly recognized as his father's chest, tearing into his flesh. He wanted to throw up, to scream, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, his mind reeling from the horrific sight of the violence. The figures began to chant louder, their voices rising and falling in a gruesome, hypnotic rhythm that felt dizzying. He watched, horrified, as they began to carve into his father's body, tearing away pieces of his skin and muscle. The sight of his flesh being torn, the blood pooling and glistening under the faint moonlight that streamed through the windows, was more than his young mind could bear. He saw them lift pieces of his father's body. He saw them bring it to their mouths, chewing with a hungry, silent intensity. A wave of intense nausea hit him, stronger than anything he had felt before, and he stumbled back, nearly losing his footing on the stairs, trying to get away from the sickening sight. He clamped a hand over his mouth, trying to stifle the retching that threatened to erupt from him.
He couldn't breathe anymore. His chest felt too tight and constricted. The air in the house was thick with the smell of blood and something else, something foul and unnatural like decaying meat mixed with stale incense, a truly terrible combination if it... He watched, transfixed by the horror as they continued their gruesome feast, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the moon, revealing sharp teeth and hungry eyes that were not human. They were monsters, feasting on his father's body right in his own living room. A primal scream tore through him, finally breaking free, a high-pitched wail of pure, unadulterated terror and grief. The scream shattered the chanting, cutting through the eerie silence like a blade of glass. All the figures froze, their heads snapping up, their glowing eyes turning as one towards him on the stairs. An action that felt coordinated and menacing. The woman from upstairs, her face now fully visible in the moonlight, gaunt with skin like parchment stretched over sharp bones, and a mouth that stretched into an unnaturally wide, predatory smile, was among them. Her eyes, those same chilling pinpricks of light, locked onto his, and he knew he was the only thing they could see. A shiver, colder than anything he had ever known, raced through his entire body, and he knew, with the certainty that chilled him to his core, that he had been seen. He didn't wait to see what they would do next. He didn't need to be told. He turned and scrambled back up the stairs, his small legs pumping as fast as they could, each step a desperate plea for his escape, a frantic effort to put distance between himself and the horror below. He could hear them behind him, a flurry of movement, the rustle of their dark robes, and then a chorus of low, hungry growls and sharp, quick footsteps. The sounds were no longer whispers. They were the sounds of predators closing in, sounds of pure evil intent. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away, far away from the blood, from the tearing flesh, from the monsters that had stolen his parents. He burst into his own room, slamming the door shut and fumbling for the small, flimsy latch, his mind barely functioning. His hands trembled so violently that he could barely hold them, but he finally managed to slide the bolt into place with a desperate push. He leaned against the door, panting, his heart threatening to burst out of his chest, aching with the effort and the terror. He could hear them right outside his room now, their footsteps light but quick, then a soft scratching at his door, like long, sharp nails dragging across the wood with a terrifying, slow noise. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to wish them away, trying to pretend this wasn't happening, but the sounds were too real, too close to ignore. A low, sibilant whisper came from just outside his door, a voice that was both ancient and feminine, unnervingly sweet.
Little morsel, where are you? Come out and play.
It was the woman from downstairs, her voice laced with a terrifying sweetness that made his stomach churn and his head swim. He could feel the door vibrate faintly, as if something was pressing against it, pushing too hard. He scrambled under his bed, pulling his worn blanket tightly around him, wishing he could disappear into the mattress, into the cool darkness. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and he could hear a faint splintering sound as the latch began to give way, bit by tiny bit. He huddled under the bed, his knees pulled tight to his chest, every muscle in his body screaming to run, but there was nowhere left to go, trapped and cornered. The scratching at the door intensified, accompanied by a low, guttural humming that vibrated through the floorboards, like a dark, unsettling melody. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sounds, trying to block out the horrifying images burned into his mind. His mother's vacant eyes, his father's desecrated body. The memories swirled together in a terrifying mix. The sweet, metallic smell of blood was now strong even in his room, seeping under the door, filling his lungs and making him cough. He could taste bile rising in his throat from the fear. Suddenly, with a loud crack, the door burst open, tearing free of the shattered latch and crashing against the wall with a sickening impact. He flinched, biting back a scream, and pressed himself even tighter into the dark space under his bed, trying to become a part of the floor. He could hear the soft, unhurried footsteps entering his room, the rustle of their dark robes, slow and deliberate. He tried to hold his breath, tried to make himself as small and invisible as possible, praying he wouldn't be found. A shadow fell over the small gap between the bed and the floor, and he could see a sliver of dark fabric, the hem of one of their cloaks, just inches from his face, and he knew they were looking for him. He held his breath until his lungs ached and burned, like a hard knot in his stomach that felt like a rock. He could hear the soft scuffing of footsteps moving around his small room, slow and quiet, and then a low whisper, raspy and dry.
You are here. I can feel you.
The voice was like dry leaves rubbing together, and it sent another wave of terror through him, knowing he was completely exposed. He imagined their glowing eyes searching, their gaunt faces hungry, just inches above him. He felt a tremor in the bed, as if someone was leaning on it, their weight pressing down, and then a long, slender finger, tipped with a sharp, dark, just inches from his face, feeling around for him. He whimpered, a tiny sound he couldn't stop, a tiny release of air that gave him away, and instantly the finger stopped moving, freezing in place. The footsteps paused. The air grew still, heavy with an expectant silence that was more terrifying than any noise. He knew they had heard him. The small sound was too loud in the quiet room. He could feel their presence, a cold, predatory awareness, pressing down on him, surrounding the bed. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that he was sure they could hear now too. He squeezed his eyes shut again, wishing he were anywhere else, wishing he had never woken up, never opened that door, never seen anything. A tremor in the bed, as if someone was leaning on it, their weight pressing down, and then a long, slender finger, tipped with a sharp, dark nail, slowly dragged itself across the floor, just inches from his face, feeling around for him. He whimpered, a tiny sound he couldn't stop, a tiny release of air that gave him away, and instantly the finger stopped moving, freezing in place. The footsteps paused. The air grew still, heavy with an expectant silence that was more terrifying than any noise. He knew they had heard him. The small sound was too loud in the quiet room. He could feel their presence, a cold, predatory awareness, pressing down on him, surrounding the bed. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that he was sure they could hear now too. He squeezed his eyes shut again, wishing he were anywhere else, wishing he had never woken up, never opened that door, never seen anything.
A low chuckle, dry and chilling, echoed from above the bed, a sound of cruel amusement.
I have found you, little one.
The words were soft, but they vibrated with a predatory delight that turned his blood into ice, chilling his entire body. He felt the mattress shift violently, and then a strong hand gripped his ankle, pulling him with surprising brutal force from under the bed. He gasped, scrambling and kicking with all his might, trying to pull away to free his leg, but the grip was too strong, like iron clamped around his bone. He was dragged out into the dim moonlight, his eyes squeezed shut against the inevitable revelation, the horrifying sight of their faces. When he opened them, he was staring up at the faces of 3 women, their features gaunt and sharp, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light that made them look like predators. The woman from earlier, the one with the impossibly wide smile, held his ankle, her grip unyielding. Her breath, when she leaned closer, smelled of stale blood, and something else, something sweet and cloying that made his head spin with dizziness.
Such a tender
She hissed, her smile widening further, revealing her teeth that were too long, too pointed for a human mouth, designed to tear. He tried to scream, but only a strangled choke came out, a pathetic, useless sound. He struggled against her grip, twisting his body, his small hands flailing and pushing, but she held him effortlessly, like he weighed nothing. The other two women stood over him. Their faces were impassive, their eyes reflecting the same cold, deep hunger that promised pain. One of them, older and more withered, held a small dark pouch from which a faint earthy scent emanated, like buried things. He knew instinctively that whatever was in that pouch was not good, that it was meant for something terrible and evil, something to aid their dark purpose. He felt a profound aching loneliness, knowing his parents were gone, knowing he was truly alone and helpless against them. The woman holding him leaned in closer, her sharp fingernails digging into his skin, the pressure making him whimper and wince in pain.
"Don't struggle, little one. It only makes it worse,"
she purred, her voice a low, terrifying sound that should have been comforting, but instead filled him with unimaginable dread and fear. He could feel tears streaming down his face, hot against his cold skin, tears of grief and utter terror. He closed his eyes, not wanting to see the hunger in their eyes, not wanting to see the horror that was about to unfold right in front of him. He felt himself being lifted, his small body weightless in the woman's surprisingly strong arms, a limp, helpless bundle. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, but he could feel the cold night air on his skin as they carried him out of his room, out of the house, and into the vast darkness. He could hear the familiar sounds of the night, the distant chirping, the movement of the air in the trees, but now they were overlaid with the sinister whispers of the women, their low chants filling the air with a chilling melody. He wanted to shout for help, for a neighbor, for anyone, but his throat was tight with fear, unable to produce a sound, locked up tight. He could feel the rough ground under him as they moved, the occasional brush of tall grasses against his legs, the bumpy, uneven surface a sign they were far from the road. They were taking him somewhere, he knew. But where? And for what specific, terrible reason? The metallic, sweet smell of blood was still strong, clinging to him, to them, to the very air around them like a suffocating perfume. He could hear the other women walking alongside, their soft footsteps barely disturbing the silence of the night, moving with practiced ease. A profound sense of helplessness washed over him, a crushing weight that left him numb and despairing.
He felt himself being placed on something cold and hard, the surface rough and unforgiving. He slowly, cautiously opened his eyes. He was in the village graveyard, the familiar tombstones casting long, grotesque shadows in the moonlight, looking like strange, twisted figures. The air here was heavy, with the scent of damp earth and decay, a smell that now mingled sickeningly with the coppery tang of blood, a truly awful mix. The three women stood over him, their faces illuminated by the eerie light, their expressions grim and expectant, focused entirely on the upcoming ritual. In the center of the graveyard, on a large flat slab of stone, lay a mangled animal carcass, its fur matted with dark congealed blood, a sign of their earlier dark work. The oldest woman, the one with the withered face, stepped forward, holding the small dark pouch, her eyes intent on the stone. She began to chant, her voice rising and falling in a strange guttural language he didn't understand, a language that felt old and dangerous. As she chanted, a faint greenish glow began to emanate from the pouch, casting an unearthly light on their faces and the tombstones. He watched, terrified, as she opened the pouch, and from it, a thick, black liquid, like crude oil, began to ooze out, dripping faintly onto the ground, sizzling faintly, as it touched the earth with a soft, disturbing sound. The black liquid snaked across the ground, forming intricate patterns, glowing faintly in the moonlight, drawing his terrified eyes. The air grew colder rapidly, and a strange, sickly sweet scent, different from the blood, but equally disturbing, filled his nostrils. making him feel faint and dizzy. He shivered hard, not just from the cold, but from the raw, unadulterated fear that was gripping him, a fear of the unknown power they wielded. The chanting intensified, becoming a wild, frenzied chorus, and the women began to sway, their dark robes swirling around them like fast-moving shadows. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, of ancient evil being awakened and coming to life in the small graveyard. Then, from the dark sky above, a massive, coiled form began to descend, slowly dropping from the unseen trees. It was a python, but unlike any snake he had ever seen, impossibly large and terrifying. Its scales shimmered with an unnatural, sickly green glow, and its eyes, two enormous, luminous orbs, fixed on him with an unnerving intensity, a predator's unblinking stare. It was impossibly large, its body as thick as a tree trunk, and it moved with a silent, terrifying grace, coming closer. The women continued their frenzied chanting, their eyes wide with a strange, dark reverence as the colossal serpent descended, slowly, deliberately, towards the stone slab in the center of the graveyard. The enormous python landed with a soft, almost imperceptible thud on the stone slab, its immense body coiling and uncoiling slowly, settling onto the cold surface. Its glowing green eyes never left him, and he felt a cold, primal fear gripping him, a fear far deeper than anything he had experienced before, the fear of being prey. The women's chanting intensified, becoming a wild, frenzied chorus, and their movements became more erratic, almost like a frantic, celebratory dance. He wanted to scream again, a full, desperate shout, but his throat was dry, his voice lost somewhere in the depths of his terror and paralysis. The largest woman, the one who had dragged him from under his bed, approached the python, her hands raised in a gesture of supplication, bowing before the beast. She spoke to it in the same guttural language as the chants, her voice filled with a reverence that chilled him to the bone, a sign of worship. The python slowly uncoiled its head, bringing its massive, scaly face closer to her. Accepting her attention, he could see its fangs, long and sharp, glistening faintly in the moonlight, ready to strike. A dark, slimy liquid dripped from its mouth, sizzling slightly as it touched the stone surface.
The woman then turned her gaze back to him, her smile wide and predatory, a final, chilling expression of evil triumph. "The offering is ready," she hissed, her voice vibrating with dark excitement and anticipation, a tone that made his stomach drop. The python's glowing eyes shifted from the woman back to him, and he felt a sudden, profound sense of dread, a chilling realization of what was truly happening, a realization that was too much to bear. He was the offering. He was the meal, the sacrifice they had brought here for their monstrous god. He tried to scramble away, to claw at the ground, to push himself backward, but he was too weak, too small, and the women were too many, their eyes watching his every move. His strength was completely gone, replaced by a numbing, heavy terror. The python began to move, its enormous head slowly turning towards him, its body beginning to slither off the stone slab, a slow, unstoppable advance. He could feel the vibrations through the ground, a low, unsettling rumble that resonated through his very bones, a warning of its approach. The other two women moved closer to him, their hands reaching out, their touch cold and skeletal, ready to deliver him. He closed his eyes again, not wanting to see the monstrous python approaching, not wanting to see the end that was now so terrifyingly close, accepting his fate. He felt himself being lifted again, this time by multiple hands, strong and cold, his small body easily raised. He was carried towards the python, which had now fully descended from the slab and was coiling itself on the ground, its head raised high, its glowing green eyes fixed entirely on him. The stench of decay and something sweet and sickly, which he now recognized as the serpent's breath, filled his nostrils, making him gag and choke.
The women's chants intensified, now a joyous, triumphant wail, their voices echoing off the tombstones, celebrating their dark ritual and their success. He was utterly helpless, a tiny sacrifice in a world gone completely mad and ruled by these cruel women and their beast. He was placed directly in front of the python, so close he could feel the cold air emanating from its immense scales, the icy chill of its body. He opened his eyes, staring directly into those luminous, predatory green orbs, and saw his own terrified reflection in them, a tiny, blurred image. The python's mouth slowly began to open, revealing a cavernous maw, dark and slick with saliva. He could see its enormous fangs, long and sharp, glistening with venom, and hear the soft hiss of its breath, like wind through dry leaves, but full of a terrifying hunger that could not be denied. The python's head lowered, slowly, deliberately towards him, an unstoppable force closing in. He could feel its hot, fetid breath on his face, the air thick with the smell of death and decay, a smell that was the last thing he would ever know. He squeezed his eyes shut one last time, a silent plea forming on his lips, a desperate wish for anyone, anything to save him from this unimaginable horror. He heard the women's triumphant cries, their voices echoing in the night, their satisfaction palpable, celebrating the impending feast. He felt the cold, slimy touch of the python's skin against his cheek, and then a searing pain as its enormous mouth opened wider and its fangs pierced his skin, and a burning sensation spread rapidly throughout his body, paralyzing him immediately. He gasped, a final, choked sound that was swallowed by the darkness of the serpent's mouth. He felt the crushing pressure, the tearing of flesh, the sharp, agonizing pain as the python's jaw constricted, and then a burning sensation spreading rapidly throughout his body, making his limbs heavy and useless. He could hear the women's joyful whispers fading away, their voices a distant, satisfied hum. The last thing he felt was the agonizing constriction, the pressure growing tighter and tighter, crushing the life out of him as the monstrous serpent began to swallow him whole, inch by agonizing inch, into the unfathomable depths of its terrible hunger. The world went black, silent, and final, leaving only the crushing darkness.
That's just the beginning of this story. You won't believe what happens next, so keep an eye out for part 2, coming soon. And hey, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it to help grow this small channel. Every click and comment really helps more than you know. Thank you so much for the support.